So, good morning to all of you, and thank you so much for being here with us for today's session. Uh, as we all know, anticipatory action is one of the buzzwords today, but more importantly, it really does present us with a new way of thinking and transforming the humanitarian action. More concretely, anticipatory action allows us to put into practice the promise of anticipation and early action alongside innovative data analysis and modeling to inform collective response. Today, across the world, there are numerous actors working and innovating and putting new data and analysis techniques and models into practice. In many ways, the momentum around anticipatory action is accelerating further alongside progress on data preparedness and work around predictive analytics and forecasting. It is equally important to then contextualize these data-driven activities and initiatives in tandem with growing data protection and governance risks and challenges. Collective anticipatory action remains an innovative space. And in this spirit of collaborative learning, today this panel aims to facilitate a discussion on the various and ongoing AA initiatives, their impact, as well as some of the challenges, gaps, and opportunities that we have and are faced with. And finally, together to try and chart out ways in which we can work for greater sustainability and better synergy building to accelerate anticipatory action analytics efforts. So, based on this, today we have with us an esteemed panel of experts on anticipatory action who will not only share their insights and initiatives, but hopefully we'll have a nice and lively debate and discussion at the end. So, to introduce our panelists to you, we have Leonardo Milano from OCHA, Justin Ginetti from IFRC, Fatma Saeed, and Muhammad Rizki from IOM. Thank you all for being here and giving us your time. Today's session is planned out as follows. First, session one will be a presentation where each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to present their recent innovations in data analysis, as well as ongoing AA initiatives at their respective organizations. And then in session two, we'll have a Q&A session to discuss some of the emerging questions, ideas, as well as to kind of provide an opportunity for us all to discuss how we can collectively build a stronger network to foster progress and synergies within this scope of work. So without taking much time, let me pass over to our first presenter and panelist, Leonardo. Leonardo, feel free to introduce yourself and yeah, the floor is yours. Sorry, Leonardo, you're on mute.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So I'm sharing my screen and I have a short presentation to introduce the work that OCHA is doing on predictive analytics and anticipatory action. So I'm Leonardo, I'm working for the UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, and I'm leading the predictive analytics team at the center. So let me just start by saying that one of the factors that is enabling anticipatory action is, is part of the long-term investment that OCHA is doing on, developing tools and making decision makers able to take better decisions based on evidence and data. So in this sense, the mission of the center, since its establishment, is to increase the use and the impact of data in humanitarian response, and we're doing this in many different ways. But one of the buzzwords, as you said in the introduction, is really around predictive analytics. So I just want to take a moment to sort of like set the scene and explain where within the broader analytical framework that is used in the humanitarian sector, where predictive analytics sits. So if we just look at the analysis that is done in the humanitarian sectors, you see that there are different levels of analysis that can be done. So going, from more exploratory analysis that is mainly looking at, looking for, the information that is available, understanding the quality, the usability of the different inputs, to something that is more descriptive, that is really looking at, who was involved, what are the main impacts, where, and so on, to maybe going, and you see that we're going, from analysis that are providing hindsights to analysis that are providing more insights on trying to explain, what are the factors that are connected to a given outcome, and potentially also what is causing a given a given impact, or, if we're talking about humanitarian needs, to something that is then, more trying to interpret the analysis, meaning, what does it imply, and maybe come to a conclusion and potentially to the consequences, to then predictive analytics. So I just wanted to show this to explain how predictive analytics is not isolated from the broader analysis spectrum of the in the humanitarian sector, and most importantly, that predictive analytics builds upon all the different analyses that are done in the sector. So let's take an example of a typhoon in the Philippines, for instance. If we do some exploration, we look, for impact data, and we look, for the different data sources, and we try to describe. So we are at the level of descriptive analytics, the scale of the impact, and the number of people that were affected, and so on. And then we try to explain, and we are in the exploratory analysis phase, what are the main risk factors and vulnerability factors that led to a given outcome. And then, we try to make to understand, and doing more interpretation, and to better understand what are the possible implications. But then the step that we are doing now with predictive analytics is using this information to predict the impact of a future event. And for instance, that's exactly what we have done together with the Netherlands Red Cross and 510 in the Philippines. So we have an anticipatory action framework that, based on the humanitarian impacts and the historical impact data that we have, is basically predicting for upcoming events, for future events, on the basis of the weather forecast, the actual impact in terms of housing destruction, number of people affected, and severity of needs to some degree. So the fact that we are now able to, moving from something that is, looking backwards and responding to something that is proactively trying to anticipate the impact of a given crisis, is really what is new in the approach of predictive analytics and anticipatory action. So if we now look specifically at anticipatory action, I think the big shift that is happening with all the projects that are going on by many different actors is really like a shift from a humanitarian response that is aimed at addressing humanitarian needs, to a humanitarian action and interventions that are aimed at mitigating the impact of an upcoming crisis. And you see that we have good evidence already that this is a faster, cheaper, and more dignified way of providing assistance, and it leads to a significant impact reduction in most of the cases. So OCHA is piloting this approach in many different contexts and for different shocks. So going from the example that I just gave for typhoons in the Philippines to floods in Nepal and Bangladesh, we're also working a lot on drought and dry spells, both in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel, looking at the feasibility of the same approach for infectious diseases like cholera in DRC and Mozambique, and also plague in Madagascar. Just as an example, I can also talk about the one of the first pilots for floods that we have activated in 2020. Really like to see, and you see on the left, what's the window of opportunity that this new approach is providing to humanitarians. So you see, for instance, the is a seasonal shock, and especially in Bangladesh, we're talking about the Jamuna River Basin, and SURF, the Central Emergency Response Fund, has been responding year on to this type of events. But you see that with respect to the peak of the flooding, the current system was always late. Now, by using hydrological models and flood predictions to trigger humanitarian financing, we were able to, release funding and already provide assistance before the peak of the flooding. And of course, you'll see in the slide that the cost is reduced and the impact is reduced, and also the procurement and logistics cost is significantly lower. Of course, this approach, especially if we look at the analytical side, requires data, and especially in the humanitarian context, the gaps in the available data are significant and persistent. So we have just published a report that is called "A State of Open Humanitarian Data," where we have actually looked at the core data sets that are needed in all humanitarian contexts to scale up this approach of anticipatory action, and we have highlighted the main gaps. And I think this is something that as a community we should address if we really want to mainstream and scale up this approach. And just the last thing that I would like to mention is that all this work is exciting, but we need to make sure that we do it in an ethical and responsible way. So the center is investing a lot around promoting a responsible use of predictive analytics. And the main concrete tool that we have produced is a peer review framework that is really like a way to do an ethical assessment, a technical and an ethical assessment of, before we deploy these models and we use these, and we use predictive analytics. We know that models are not perfect. We know that models, may eventually have limitations or fail. I think it's very important to understand who's bearing the risks of the model's failures. So to make sure that by deploying and relying on new technologies, we don't create additional harm. So, and this is really like something that we do, and it's very, done in collaboration with independent experts. We have a pool of technical and ethical reviewers. So I'm just leaving here the link if you're interested in engaging on this topic. So yeah, that's it from my end. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward for a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leonardo. That was super, super informative and interesting. I'll now pass over to Rizky from IOM. And I'm sharing my screen. Could you tell me if you can see my screen? Yeah, all right.
Yes.
Okay, Rizky, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Prithvi. I think, yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, so hi everyone. My name is Muhammad Rizky. I'm working at the Displacement Tracking Metrics team at IOM headquarters here in Geneva. Maybe we can move to the first slide. Yes, thank you very much. So maybe I'll start with the DTM first before we get into our engagement in terms of anticipatory action analytics discussion. For you that might not have heard DTM, we gather and analyze data to disseminate critical multi-layered information on mobility, vulnerabilities, and needs. These are the type of information that we collect of the displaced and mobile populations, targeting to enable decision makers and responders to provide populations in need with better context-specific assistance. So this is how we frame everything that we are doing under the DTM. We work in emergency contexts, but also beyond, including in preparedness, building capacity of governments and local partners, as well as in transition and recovery contexts, including in informing and measuring solutions for the internal displays. Now, you see on the screen, this is our toolbox. So it consists of 4 major components. We have what we call mobility tracking, flow monitoring, registration, and surveys. Each of these components include variety of data collection exercise, and they are deployed to answer operational data and information needs to serve the collective response. So in a way, we pick and choose the different data collection exercise based on the actual needs at the operational level. You can see on the slide here, each of these components has very specific purpose. As an example, within the mobility tracking component, we have exercise we call the baseline assessment, multi-sector location assessment, emergency event tracking, and so on and so forth. Similarly, for flow monitoring, we have different exercises such as flow monitoring registry, flow monitoring surveys, and flow monitoring point assessment, just as an example. So it's collection of the different tools. Let's put it that way. The DTM employs a very large network of information. We're active in 85 countries. The technical experts include various profiles from assessment coordinators, GIS experts, data scientists, analysts, as well as operation support. The team, the core team, the technical team, connect to over 300,000 community-level key informants around the world through more than 7,000 data collectors. So I'm trying to say that it's a large network of informations that becomes our backbone to get reliable and credible data from the ground, fast and efficient. Now, the DTM within IOM sits under what we call Global Data Institute. We work closely with IOM's Preparedness and Response Division within the Department of Operations and Emergency. My colleague Fatma Said is here, the one that oversees the organization's overall approach on anticipatory action. IOM does a lot on this, but for this presentation, I will be only focusing on the data aspect of the work we're doing from the DTM side. But my here also probably to answer some of the questions that will link to a broader organization's approach in terms of AA later. Now, the next slide here, after going through a bit on the DTM and what we're doing, I wanted to say that we really believe that DTM data plays key role in developing AA analytics model, especially as human mobility dynamic is very much interlinked with all different things, with shocks, vulnerabilities, and risk in so many different ways. And I was trying to think of why our data becomes so relevant. First of all, we are collecting time series data from regular rounds of data collection. So the DTM methodology implies regular rounds of collections to enable the trend analysis and be able to monitor the changes observed on the ground. I think this is one first reason that we thought of, and then the next one is about location data. It's one of the most important data piece from the data sets that we collect. Location data enables interoperability. As we know, building models require us to work with various data sets from different sources, and interoperability would be one of the most important factors, I would say, whereby location data will then enable for spatial analysis, and especially when we're doing area-based analysis. DTM also collects mobility data at lowest possible observation point. So in different countries, depend on how far we can go. We go to the community or village level, and even at the actual location, such as IDP camps, collective centers, and so on and so forth. So we really get the out of the data, we really get the sense of the understanding of the human mobility dynamics at the hyperlocal level. Finally, in terms of global standard, I think we can go back to the slide before. Yeah, just on the last point, I wanted to touch a bit on the fact that, you know, in DTM, we set up a core standard on all the different exercises that we're doing, but we're still leaving space to allow for contextualization and adaptation on the ground. This ensures that exercise remains relevant for the operation on the ground, but at the same time, it will support comparability at a higher geographical level. It can be sub-regional, regional, or cross-regional level. When we talk about development of models that cover larger geographical areas. Yeah, I think we go, yes. Thanks, Prithvi. So those thinking frame our approach on AA analytics. You know, the first approach that we have is to make sure that the efforts is integrated into DTM field operations and built on existing data, not only on existing data and capacity, but also network on the ground in the country. We see our 85 field operations as a kind of a lab to encourage colleagues to innovate more in terms of more and better use of the data that they are collecting, and you know, it fosters more of this approach in the field, and the more we try to come up with better ways of analyzing our data, then we share that between the different operations. Second one, what is most important for us on the DTM side is engagement with academia and other partners on the use of the data, because the data itself, it's massive. So there's a lot of untapped potentials, I would say, and no matter how much capacity we have on the DTM side, you know, it's never enough to try to make more use of this data. Next one is partnership and joint efforts. We fully realize that there's no way anyone can do this alone. So this is also very important for us. We work very closely with Leonardo and his team, for example, at the center. Also with Justin and team at the IFRC. We work very closely with FAO on some joint initiatives related to AA analytics. So the more efforts needs to be done to do more, you know, joint exercise on anticipatory action analytics. And lastly is the from the global. This is in particular from our global team here. We have been strengthening and keep strengthening the data science capacity within our team. Also working closely with the other program areas within IOM, including WASH, health, and many others. As the new technologies keep coming up, we keep exploring different innovative approach and ways on the use of data and come up with different models and experiments on how we can do more on this. Next slide. Yes, and I think this slide echoes what Leonardo mentioned in his presentation. Like for us, it's the same. Early on, we understood that all the forecasting and predictive modeling works must be done in ethical and responsible way. On the left, it's starting from the work that was done by Harvard Humanitarian Initiative there on ethical obligations for humanitarian information activities a couple of years ago, we continuously intensifying our work on data ethics and responsibility fronts in collaboration with everyone else, especially with OCHA's data center in The Hague. With GFFO in 2019, for example, we organized multi-stakeholder workshop, not only to discuss the forecasting works, but also measures, safeguards that are required to mitigate any potential concerns on ethics and accountability in progressing forecasting modeling work. There is also the data science and ethics group. It's another multi-partner groups that brings everyone together to talk about data science and ethics. Within this group, then there was the framework for ethical use of advanced science methods in the humanitarian sectors developed that led to the development of decision tree that could inform, data science decisions on developing data science methods on so many different things. Within the interagency steering committee, IOM with OCHA and UNHCR also co-led the development of operational guidance for data responsibility in humanitarian actions. And coming up now, we are working we are working together with Yale School in Public Health and launching the Data Responsibility Journal to collect more knowledge and experience on the data responsibility front. So all of this basically guides our approach and thinking in being more responsible in relation to progressing our anticipatory action, analytics, and modeling work. I have the last slide, I think. Yeah, these are just some, snapshots of key highlights from ongoing work. I intentionally pick samples from the field. We have the transhuman tracking tool in West and Central Africa, providing early warning mechanism in East and Horn of Africa. We work with many partners to extend the analysis and modeling work using DTM data to look at the nexus of climate, conflict, and displacement and human mobility in the regions. In Somalia, we're doing some exciting work on forecasting on displacement caused by drought. In Uganda, we're using DTM to implement multi-hazard early warning tools as well. I invite everyone to check our website at dtm.iom.int to learn more of this. I think I'm gonna stop there. Prithvi, thank you so much for the floor. Passing it back to you. Over.
Thank you so much, Rizky. And now I'll pass it over to you, Justin. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Prithvi. Thanks so much to IOM. Thanks, Leonardo, Fatima, and Rizky for opportunity to be here with you and speak. I'll try sharing my screen too. Cross your fingers and hope that this works. I've got a few slides to share just to help sort of set the stage for the discussion that we'll have just afterward. And the focus we'll address really how IFRC is using different tools and means of data analysis to scale up our work on anticipatory action to meet some of our broader corporate-wide targets and objectives. Before I dive into the how, I think it's important that we understand why we're doing this and why we're developing these tools and these models. We're not doing it for the we're not part of academia. We're not doing this just for the sake of developing new knowledge, but we have some very operational needs and practical needs. So the first is to make anticipatory action the new business as usual. So we're about to launch an operational framework for scaling up anticipatory action in the coming weeks that will be publicly available. And one of the targets therein is to scale up our anticipatory action work to 80 countries by 2025 from about 30 or so today. The other aspect of it is to really provide the evidence base for our senior management to manage our own fund, the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, or DREF, for both anticipatory action and disaster response. And one of the plans therein as well is to allocate about 25% of the 500 million per year for investment on anticipatory action. So that's why we're doing this. And the other aspect of it is to help understand how we manage that fund with the evidence that is available on different risks. So here you see what's called a loss exceedance curve, and it represents the sort of the spectrum of risk, or economic loss risk in this case, within a given country, Guatemala. And the idea here is if you have a full picture of the risk in a given country, you can understand, or you can plan how to allocate funding ex ante to address that risk. So for the rare but high impact events that are sort of on the right-hand side of the screen there, we can say, okay, those are beyond the scope of the DREF, and those will be events that are so big they'll elicit an international humanitarian response funded by something like the SURF that Leonardo was talking about just a couple of minutes ago. Then the next tranche of risk is exactly what the DREF has been set up for, and it will cover events from this order of magnitude to that order of magnitude. And those thresholds can be defined using the evidence based in advance. And then there will always be a residual amount of risk that the DREF and the SURF will not cover, and that's to help national societies understand how much risk is on their territories, and that they'll be responsible for dealing with and managing on their own. It's also to help us understand what actions to take to address the risks. So for those high frequency, low impact events, we know that by using from the analysis and from the models, we know that that risk is driven by human vulnerability, and there's a strong opportunity to reduce the risk through investing in social and human and economic development. Whereas for those events that are on the right-hand side of the curve, those rare but high impact events, there's less that can be done to reduce the vulnerability or to reduce the risk of the impact occurring, but it's more about how can we best prepare for those events to avoid the worst outcomes when they do occur. So how are we doing this? So we have a few kind of key objectives which will organize I've organized the remaining slides around these few bullet points here. So we've developed something called the Go Platform Risk Watch, which I'll show you in just a second, which we're using to help prioritize which hazards and countries to focus on, what anticipatory actions to take, and to develop triggers and then monitor the impacts of forecasted hazards to understand when those triggers have been reached. So firstly, this is all going to be available on the Go platform, which is go.ifrc.org, which people have historically been coming to get information about ongoing crises or crises that have just occurred here, as you can see, in the last month or so. Here are ongoing operations. You just get a bird's eye view of what's happening around the world and what IFRC is involved in. And this just tells us here how many people have been using the Go platform per month, per year, and that number has grown quite considerably, and we're up to about 20,000+ users a month, or at least we were midway through last year. So this new risk module aims to do the following. As I mentioned, it's going to provide information about future risks to prioritize attention and resources. It will visualize the modeled impacts of forecasted and observed hazards. And then it will also contain, as Leonardo also mentioned, critically, information about past events so that we can learn from those, understand spatial and temporal trends, and use that evidence base to inform both anticipatory action and responses. So this is just a schematic diagram of how it fits together. You can see the Go platform is represented by that red pillar there on the right. And we're drawing a lot of information in from risk models and hazard impact forecast models from our partners. And the main takeaway on this is to note that IFRC is not doing the modeling itself. We're not developing new impact forecast models in-house, but rather we're working with partners, whether they be partners from the UN, from academia, or from the private sector or civil society, and we're curating those models. And we're creating an even playing field upon which all of these different modeling teams will essentially provide their outputs so that we can then in turn evaluate them with using observational data and monitor the performance of each of these different models against one another and to track their improvement over time, which is something we'll come back to later. As I mentioned, this is very much a collaborative effort. You can see just some of the partners there with whom we're working on the left. It's a range, as I said, from UN, from academia, as well as private sector. And it's not a closed loop there. There are many others who we aim to bring on board. So again, going back to these use cases. So firstly, we will use the historical data as well as the data from the risk models to understand which hazards to focus on. So here we see, using our own data from the DREF, that in sub-Saharan Africa, we tend to use that money to respond to floods. The vast majority of the events that I called up are all but one happen to be flood events. Then if we look at which countries to focus on, here you can see a map of Africa along the bottom of the screen. There's a slider, and if we go month by month by month, the map automatically updates. Here we're looking at the risk of people displaced per month per country, and you can see for April, the displacement risk happens to be concentrated in the Greater Horn of Africa region from Tanzania up north to Ethiopia. We can also look at the same flood hazard, but not using the risk of displacement, but the monthly inform risk metrics. And again, it tells us more or less the same thing. And the point here being, we don't need to rely on just one risk or one impact, but we can draw upon information from different providers or different teams to see if they converge or if they're telling us a different story. Here, as you can see, they are similar. They're telling us the same story about where the risk of flood impacts are likely to occur over the coming month or so. So once we know which countries and which hazards to focus on, then we would want to know which actions to take. So this is, again, where the historical data comes in. So we, along with a number of different partners, are developing a global crisis data bank, which it will include information about responses or anticipatory actions and what was taken, what measures were taken, where, and to what effect, with time series data to understand which have the biggest impact and which are the most effective and cost-effective things that one can take, what actions that one can take in a given in a given context. Once we've got that under our belt, we can then move on to saying, okay, let's say we're going to put in place a mechanism for forecast-based action. One of the things that you would need to do is establish a trigger. So here for flooding in Kenya, which was one of the countries highlighted in the previous slides, we can dive down into the data for the country, and we can say, okay, for flooding in Kenya, here is the risk of displacement for events of a given return period. So what does a 1 in 20-year event look like? What does a 1 in 50-year event, 1 in 100-year event, or 1 in 250-year event look like in terms of the number of people at risk of being displaced? And then once we know that information, we can use that to establish the trigger. And then we have to monitor and forecast the impacts of these detected hazards as they occur in space and time to understand when a trigger has been reached. At the moment, there isn't a flood occurring of that scale in Kenya, but I just wanted to call up, using another part of the same risk module, the hazard impact forecasting component. And here you can see that in the case of Indonesia, where there is flooding ongoing, one of our partners, in this case the Pacific Disaster Center, has provided their impact forecasts for this event, and you can see that pop-up table in the middle of the screen with some of the information about the people and assets exposed and the likely damage that's going to occur in that particular context. In the case of the Kenya floods, we would do something very similar. It's just that it would be flooding in Kenya and not flooding in Indonesia. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention, and really looking forward to the discussion. Back to you, Prithvi.
Thank you to all three of you of the panelists and your presentations. I feel like each one of you have presented a different piece of the puzzle and have kind of helped us to understand and like gain a very kind of a complex picture of anticipatory action, but also very, very interlinked. I think there are definitely lots of convergences in all three of your presentations, particularly around, data analysis, as well as looking at some of the more financial aspects and ultimately finding a way to really transform the way in which we do humanitarian action. So thank you all for your presentations. Now we will move to the second aspect of our session today, which is a Q&A. I'll start by opening up the floor to all of you, actually. And my first question to all of you is, what do you think are some of the opportunities and risks around data analysis and modeling for anticipatory action? Let's start with you, Leonardo.
Thanks. So, well, about talking specifically about, data and analysis, the opportunities are clear, and, we have growing evidence that this is an approach that actually, leads to very positive outcomes. In terms of the risks, other than, what Risky has already mentioned and what I mentioned about, potential ethical risks, I think my other concern is about, the fact that we are focusing a lot on the data and we are working in challenging contexts would be maybe around creating blind spots. We have been all piloting anticipatory action in the countries where we have forecasts, where we have information, where we have historical data. Even like with OCHA, we have been focusing on countries for which the information was available. Now, mainstreaming this approach also to context like the South Sudan or the Central African Republic, where there's much less capacity when it comes to and less information available, will be a major challenge. And I think it's something that we should keep in mind, and we don't just focus on where the information is available, but we try to come up with a model that also works for all humanitarian contexts. That's maybe one of the main concerns I have.
I think you led that perfectly for IOM to answer. So I'll pass it over to you, Fatma and Risky.
From my side, I will start with something I've been advocating for a while. Currently, a lot of the data that we have for anticipatory action is more built towards climate induced disasters or specified on specific risks. Not so much has been done on conflict at all. Conflict-related disasters. In my opinion, there's a lot of evidence out there being collected by different partners. There's DTM in IOM who does through the return index. There's Inform who also collects this data, and I'm sure other organizations probably collect this. And a good example I would say actually right now is Ukraine. There was already building tension since November last year, and it only escalated in February, 3 months later. So if we had an opportunity to build an anticipatory action model or data around conflict, I think it would solve a lot of issues as well. And then we also have things like election support or elections where we know there's likely possibility of becoming violence. A good example being Kenya this year. So these are some of the opportunities I think we can tap into. I'll pass over to Rizky if he can loop back to Leonardo.
Thanks, Fatma. Yeah, I agree with Leonardo. Like in terms of opportunities, it's quite clear. You know, technologies and tools are keep advancing at like very fast pace. Capacities in terms of data science expertise is also growing. It's one of the most sought topics of study right now. And although we do still have gaps on data, but if we look back, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, there are more data available right now than before. I just want to hammer in again on the risk side of things. We are going fast with the work, trying to catch up with the technology, and we're always one step behind on the safeguards, so to say, because most of the time you don't know that you have to react unless something happened, right? Just probably just to hammer in again, like we need to maintain the level of commitment, the level of investments on the ethics and responsibility side of things. I think the same way as we are investing and committing to the modeling work.
Thank you both, Al and Justin.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add because the ground has been well covered here. I would just maybe say the following. I mean, in terms of the opportunities, I think that one of the main opportunities is simply to, reduce human suffering through, anticipatory action, to stretch humanitarian funding further by taking more effective actions and investing in more effective interventions. And then in terms of the risks, I think one of the key risks is really about managing expectations. As Leonardo Risky said, there's a lot of investment in this. There are more and more models coming online, more partners becoming involved, but the field is still in its relative infancy, especially with regard to impact forecasting. And that's why we've taken the position of saying, let's play the curatorial role rather than having like a stake in the game. And let's make sure that we can just put in place a framework for assessing the actual performance of these different models, so that when our senior management asks the question, we can say, okay, well, these are what the models tell us, and here's how much confidence we have in what these models are saying, so that they can take a decision based on that understanding of the uncertainty. Because I think if there's a lot of excitement, and I think with excitement does kind of implicitly just raise expectations, and people think just because we can answer the question that the answer that we're going to provide is the right answer, even if it is based on some empirical evidence. But at the moment, like I said, we're still in the infancy for a lot of this work, and even though we hope to make significant progress and see more application of this in the future, we can put that at risk but we overhype it now, because if the models go spectacularly wrong early on, that can undermine confidence in the entire enterprise, which is something that we absolutely want to avoid, because it would just be counterproductive. And then the other risk, I mean, yeah, there are probably millions of examples we can provide about the safeguards that Risky mentioned, but it really goes back to this really meaningful conversation about what questions are being asked by whom, for what purpose, and then how do we answer those questions? Because at the current moment, a lot of people within the Red Cross movement want to know exactly how many IDPs there are, where are they, where do they come from, and what their needs are. But there are some tools that are potentially at our disposal to answer that question, but which would also put those very people at risk if we were to use that information and those means of analysis to answer that question. And therefore, we can't answer that question in that way, because it may indeed put the very people we're trying to help at harm. So that's, again, one of those issues that we need to balance. And luckily, both as Leonardo mentioned, as Rizky mentioned, there's been investment in those tools in the ethical framework approach to help safeguard that work. Over.
Thank you. Thank you. I see so many synergies in all of your answers. To come specifically to you, Leonardo and Justin, I had a question about what you think about, in many ways, the work around forecasting and data modeling in the humanitarian sector kind of precedes anticipatory action in what we know it as now. I'm curious to know what you think makes it different in its current avatar, and what would you say, like, what are the factors that have contributed to its importance now? What makes anticipatory action different from its predecessors, and what do you think are the factors that contribute to it?
Yeah, maybe I can start, and then Justin, you can complement. So as Rizky just mentioned, I mean, first of all, there's much more technical capacity within the humanitarian sector, and also interest, in using these tools. So that's, one, that humanitarian organizations can deal with this type of, new technologies and, and tools. A big other factor is an openness from technical experts, from academia, but also to some degree, private sector partners and the technology sort of owners to support this work. And we have seen that, we get great support from, scientists and technologists and so on. So that's another big factor. But I think also something that is also sort of like new is also at the level of key decision makers and donors. Now they are more open to accept the risk that, acting on anticipation entails. Because, and this is also linked to the fact that we have growing evidence about sort of like the return on investment, if you want, for anticipatory action. So that means that, this body of evidence and, the fact that there's also like a higher risk acceptance by humanitarians, decision makers, but also by donors and, the different funding mechanisms is really making this approach possible. Maybe over to you, Justin, if you want to complement.
Thanks, Leonardo. I think, as Leonardo said, there's a growing acceptance and recognition of this, and I think there are two factors that come into play. One is that it's just obvious humanitarian spending. If you look at it over what the needs have been over the last decade or so, they've been growing and certainly are likely to grow this year. And how sustainable is that? So on that side, there's an imperative to make the most use of the available resources. And as Leonardo just said, if there's a business case for this, if it's more cost effective to take anticipatory action than respond ex post each time, then there's that pressure. The other aspect is that there are more disasters occurring each year. The IPCC Working Group 2 report just came out, and the risk is growing, and it's not growing just due to climate change, but it's growing due to human factors. So there's again the imperative to how are we going to manage the risk, and part of that entails using science to identify what anticipatory actions you can take to mitigate some of those risks, or at least mitigate the worst impacts when hazards do manifest in an exposed area like a vulnerable coastline or a major city, and with potentially large impacts. And let me just leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you to you both. My next question is to IOM colleagues. I think it's something also you mentioned, Rizky, in your presentation where you said we can't do this alone. And I think just building on that, I suppose, given the importance of building these synergies and collaborations, not just, between actors, but across the global, regional, and country levels, what sort of practical steps do you think that we can take to ensure that these collaborations and partnerships continue to be developed and strengthened?
I could start. As you mentioned, yeah, definitely this is something. It's a new buzzword. It's not old in its entirety. So I think first thing I would suggest is probably if we can have a globally unified definition of anticipatory action. Everyone, there's OCHA working on anticipatory action, IFRC, we have FAO, we have different organizations, ECHO as well, with different definitions, sort of leaning towards the same thing, but some have a bit more elaborative definitions. So if we came up with like a globally defined definition, like for instance, the emergency response preparedness, we could come up with more defined outcomes altogether. And then secondly, I think I would say on the timeliness of developing the model. For instance, I give an example of South Sudan last year or the year before, where we're supposed to develop a model for anticipatory action for floods, but that time frame was missed because the floods actually happened before the actual thing could occur. So if we could get more synergies between the different organizations to try and come up or to agree upon a defined time frame when we're supposed to actually develop a model and to react by the time the crisis hits or before it hits, I think that would be helpful. And lastly, I would say this has been mentioned anyway, but I'm just focusing on multi-risk as opposed to single risk for some of the anticipatory action models. In Philippines, for instance, it was developed last year, but then the trigger was not met. So if that model could be used for different risk, I think that would be helpful. I think that's it from my side.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I just want to add one point on the general side. I think we are just starting now. I think we need to create supporting environments, not only for exchange and sharing, but also, you know, encouraging more people to innovate more on this. What I'm trying to say is, most of the time we say redundancy is bad, but like in this topic, probably redundancies are good because we need to create a space where everybody feels comfortable to try, experiment, and share back, and by doing that, we will keep improving. I think, and then yeah, especially to those working on the ground, as they are, you know, they are the closest to the reality.
Thank you, Rizky and Fatma. Just to build off on this as well, back to you, Justin and Leonardo. Um, oh, sorry, specifically to you, Justin, my bad. Through an engagement with private sectors and academia, especially since you know you were describing a lot of the work that you do at IFRC as curatorial and the role that that means, what can we learn and how do we build more meaningful engagements?
Sure. Well, I think Rizky actually seeded this with two key points in his answer just a second ago. I mean, one is really about the modesty of this. You know, we really do need to be quite humble and, as I mentioned, you know, take stock of where we are and with the state of our knowledge. In terms of the opportunities with the private sector and for communities, I think there are a few. On the one hand, I think there's actually been a lot of improvement and there's plenty room for more in educating the private sector partners with whom we work that we're not so naive. I mean, there's been a lot of investment in the data science in the humanitarian sector. So it used to be that the private sector companies would say, don't come and ask us for all of our data. You know, because that's, I mean, A, it just, you couldn't cope with it, B, you couldn't use it, and B, it's not available. But none of us were ever asking for all their data. And so they need to understand, they've begun increasing their confidence in us as a partner on the one side. And we've, I think, begun to demonstrate, you know, to the value we can provide back to the private sector companies when it comes to, you know, generating public goods with their information. I think the other big opportunity is also, as you mentioned, relates to the communities, because this really ultimately isn't about the building of the capacities of us in headquarters in Geneva, in New York, or elsewhere to use these tools, but it's really about empowering the actual communities themselves. So it's actually not going to be good enough if it's just a model that's running on a machine somewhere and is visualized on a server in Geneva. No, it needs to be that the colleagues in capitals and even in branch offices of local Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies need to understand what's going into these models and what's coming out of them, so that they know how much faith to put into them. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're on the ground and you've got the output of a model and you're comparing that to your lived experience over the last several years, you're obviously going to trust your lived experience more than a model. You need to understand how do you weigh those. So a lot of this has to be this complementarity of developing new things and innovating and making mistakes, as Risky just mentioned, and doing so in a safe environment, but also simultaneously building the capacities of those end users for whom this is really meant to serve in the first place. Thanks.
Thank you. And then to you, Leonardo, from your perspective, what type of collaborations between all actors do you think could be a sort of a game changer? And how can we facilitate faster and better exchange of knowledge and expertise on anticipatory action analytics?
Yeah, thanks. I think actually the slide that was presented by Justin is the best answer to this, with the continuum of risk and the different actors. And I think this is really the key to better understand, and to see risk as a continuum, and to better understand what are the different tools that we have at our disposals to mitigate the existing risk, and then, to use them appropriately and, with good synergy. So, like for small scale events may be more appropriate for, like national societies or the draft to come in, while, for major events, we may require, funding from tools like SURF. So that I think really like having, a closer exchange, but also concretely like planning a response, not at the level of single agency, but really like among the different actors, involving, of course, national authorities. It's definitely key. I also think there's a big opportunity to finally, have a point of contact between development activities and humanitarian interventions, because if humanitarians are shifting more towards acting, on the basis of risk, and we're shifting humanitarian response to, something that is aimed at mitigating and preparing, there's definitely, like a language that also speaks to development actors. So that's maybe, also like the way to go. And again, is about using in the best way the tools, the funding, and the capacity that we have in the different in the different locations. Well, other than this, more about how we implement anticipatory action in the future, I think, but that's something that I see happening a lot already, is an exchange at the technical level, when it comes to building, tools that can be used by multiple actors, and knowledge sharing. I think this is key, and we have ongoing collaborations with all the technical experts from the different agencies. So I think we are definitely going in the right direction on this front. Thanks.
Okay. And my last question is to all of you in a slightly hopeful tone. If you had a wish list for anticipatory action, what would be on it? And if you had any kind of key takeaways or any final thoughts that you would like to share with us, please feel free. Let's start with Leonardo first.
Okay, so maybe one. I mean, in terms of takeaways, you have seen that from the different perspectives, the topics, that's definitely overlap, and I think we're sharing sort of like the same vision. So in terms of like wish list, I think what I hope is that in a few years, our team, my team, will no longer work actively on developing the pilots, but we have been able to demonstrate the value, and then having local actors and national authorities, taking ownership of this approach. So as much as possible, my hope is that we demonstrate and we show the value, but then we hand over sort of like tools, and we are sort of like enablers rather than implementers in the future. That's my biggest hope.
I like that. That's ambitious and nice, and it's like localization of AA in some ways, no? Awesome. Okay, let's pass over to IOM.
From my side, it's what I said at the very beginning. My wish list is generally to see a model for conflict, anticipatory function model for conflict. But my key takeaway from this is there's a lot of work that has been done over the past year in building anticipatory action to what it is now. But I think it would also be important not to forget the general preparedness, the emergency response preparedness approach by the IAC. There's a lot of great focus on anticipatory action understood, but there's also the general preparedness which precedes all this, which I think also falls under anticipatory action. So let's not forget that side of the picture as well.
If I can add to Fatma, agree with Fatma, and also I really like Leonardo wish list. I think that could be my wish list too. And maybe I'll add. I'm trying to visualize how I see it. A double-decker bus. All the progress in terms of the modeling and prediction work with the ethics and data responsibility work. It's a double-decker bus. It needs to be a double-decker bus that goes together at the same speed. Yeah.
I like that a lot, and I enjoy the visual of a double-decker bus. I'm going to definitely use that metaphor. Thanks, Rizky. Thanks, Fatma. And Justin, over to you for your wish list.
Thanks. Well, yeah, no surprise. It's just like Leonardo said, it's really about putting the local communities and the national authorities first and empowering them. So the vision would be that they have the tools and the evidence base at their disposal to take those effective actions, and not just the evidence, but they also have the power to do so. That they are empowered as decision makers with the evidence and capacities to manage the risks for which they are responsible, and which they can't entirely avoid. Thanks.
Fantastic. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you and for all of your contributions today. I personally have learned a lot about AA, and I'm really grateful to all of you for taking the time today and sharing with us your insights. So thank you very much, and yeah, have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you,
Thank
Preeti.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
You too. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.